Is it art? I don't know! Is it art? I don't know! Is it art? Could it be? I don't know. What's that art? I don't know. Is this art? This. Is this art? Hello everybody, welcome to the next video. Man, my hair looks wild, I can see. That's alright. I want to thank Poppy Henry and Drew for helping me put the intro of all these videos together. This last one, Poppy helped me, and she was a trooper because the temperature dropped like 20 degrees while we were trying to do that, so it was very, very cold. Hence me running. Anyway, hope you like the intros, hope you like the videos. Today's topic is arts, and I want to touch on two major themes here. First, the way that art can be used as a method of mysticism, and then the second part is how art can be used to explain transcendence, basically. I'm going to try to slow down again because I watched my videos and I do realize that I do rush through things at times. I get very, very excited. As Gala Rinpoche would say, I have great enthusiasm, sometimes a little bit overwhelming. So I'm going to try to be chill and explain things, you know, especially because this one's art, so I want to be a little bit bohemian, artsy. So first of all, I want to talk about how art can be used as a method of transcendence or a method of mysticism. This is a topic that's very personal to me because I'm a photographer, and I consider my style of photography to be very Zen-oriented. I use photography as a method of meditation, and that this began when I quit smoking and I started to walk around with my camera, which I mentioned in my last video, the non-smoking video. These walks became longer and longer and longer and very, very meditative, and many times I would be chanting as I'd be walking, and I realized that if I was chanting and walking or meditating and walking, my perspective changed on things. I would notice little things, little details like cracks in walls or little flowers or all of these things, and so my photographic style kind of became this this technique of trying to show the world these little things that we pass up all the time because we're too busy with our daily lives. So the photography itself became a real instrument, a real Dharma practice for me. In fact, I kind of look at my camera as being a Dharma tool. And so my photographic walks became Zen walks, and my photography became kind of Zen photography, and the whole experience became very, very, very meditative. And that's one example of how art can become this mystical tool. Photography specifically is really good for developing breathing and meditation and perspective and all of those things. Let me explain what I mean by that. First of all, let's start with breathing. If you are trying to learn photography and you're trying to get long range shots, you'll learn that breathing is very, very important. It's a lot like, oddly enough, it's a lot like shooting a gun. And shooting a gun, you kind of hold your breath and you squeeze the trigger because you don't want the gun to move. The same is true of photography. If I'm using a telephoto lens and I'm shooting something very far away from me, I have to keep the camera very, very still. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to hold my breath. I'm going to squeeze down on the button and get my shot. So it's strange that they're both called shooting because they both involve very similar kind of approaches and ideas. The other thing about photography that is very meditative is that kind of perspective or that observational role. In meditation, the whole idea is to kind of back away from ourselves and to observe our breathing as though it's not our breathing, but it's as though this breathing is just happening. I kind of describe it as when you're waiting for a hiccup. You know, you can't control the hiccup and you don't know when the hiccup is going to come, so you kind of back away from yourself and you observe your own body, and there's a hiccup. So in meditation, I look at breathing as being the same way. I treat breathing as kind of a hiccup. I kind of back away from it and wait for it to happen, and then observe the phenomena as it's happening, and try not to control when I'm breathing in or when I'm breathing out, but just to observe that process happening, as though it's not happening to me, but it's as though it's just kind of happening somewhere in the universe and I'm observing it. So I approach photography very much the same way. I approach it as I'm an observer in this world, and I'm not really in this world, I'm just observing this world. And I try to pay attention to all of these little nuances that are in this world as though I'm visiting for the first time. And so I treat so then I see things and I'm like, oh, I see this beautiful thing that's taking place within this world. I'm going to use my camera and I'm going to capture it so that I can show it to the people of my world, wherever that world is going to be. So it's kind of like an alien visitor, Doctor Who-esque kind of attitude that I have, but this kind of allows me to back out of my own life and observe the universe very objectively. And so from that perspective, I see a camera as being very much a Dharma tool or a meditative tool, both from the breathing and kind of the backing away from things. And then there's the whole seeing the world as though it's art is kind of another step that goes to that. Because if you do this, approach photography this way for a while, then I would begin, or you or anybody would begin to see the world as snapshots of little pieces of art. Even when I watch movies too, I see the cinematography and I was like, oh, I get what they were doing, because I begin to see the world kind of the way that they do in these little framed segments. Story time. When I had the opportunity of being an extra on a couple of TV shows, and that was the one thing that I noticed is that they would crop in something so that there would only be a certain amount of space being shown, so that they could really kind of define the story that they were telling based on how much they were showing. In other words, we were in this big warehouse and they were shooting this, this one scene, and they would bring the camera in so tight that all you would see is this kind of 20 square foot. Yet outside of that 20 square foot was all this activity going on. But if you watch it, the finished product, you would never know that any of that was going on, because they kind of cropped in. And so, through this kind of Zen approach of photography, you really get this the same idea. You really begin to see the world, not like you're seeing it through blinders, but more you're seeing it as framed art. And it's kind of neat, because then again you're kind of stepping outside of yourself and being objective and taking things in. And then, so let's move away from photography and let's talk about other forms of art. Painting. Well, let me back up. In Japan, during feudal Japan, when the samurai class was still in abundance, when they stopped to kind of, when Japan united and there wasn't as many feuds between lords, the samurai weren't always rushing into battle, and they became kind of bored. And so rather than having their mind get complacent, they began to do things like calligraphy and flower arranging and all these kind of Zen practices, which mimicked very much the single-pointed concentration that they had developed for their sword work. So in that era, art and spiritual consciousness became very, very entwined. When I was in Hawaii, there was this building at the end of our street, which the locals referred to as the vegetable cult. And what they really were these Japanese practitioners that did things like flower arranging and gardening and calligraphy to achieve this kind of meditative attitude and meditative mindset through these activities. And they taught flower arranging and gardening and food preparation and all of these things, and they treated them as very much Zen and very much sacred acts. And so I love that idea that we can take anything in our life and then make it less mundane and make it spiritual and make it profound and transcendent. You know, we can, if we're arranging flowers, they can be very zen, and we can be very purposeful and very mindful. If we're, I mean, that's the whole idea of those little sandbox things that you put in your office, right? That you rake the sand, that you can, you know, the Zen sand gardens. The whole idea of that is to be mindfully sculpt sand. So art is the same thing. I'm not a painter, but I did toy around a lot with Japanese calligraphy, and that was definitely a very Zen thing. And interestingly enough, they also talk about in calligraphy controlling the breath and using your breath to make the strokes and so on and so forth. So there's definitely this tie-in between observing the breath and relaxing the mind. I don't know if that's true for other painters, but I definitely have seen painters that while they're painting, that's all that's going on is what they're painting. And so it does become this kind of mindfulness or single-pointedness of mind with that kind of art as well. I imagine it's true of all art forms, that art can be this form of active meditation because we have to pay attention to what we're doing. And that's it, right? I mean, that's the idea of meditation, is that we quiet our mind and stop the monkey mind, and we bring it in to focus on one single thing, whether that thing is a camera, a painting, our breath. You know, it's the whole act of meditation. So if you think that meditation has to be boring and sitting in a room staring at a wall, it can be that, but it can also be working on a quilt or cooking food or walking around taking pictures. The monks, the Tibetan monks, this has been a kind of a topic on my social media lately, do these sand mandalas, and the sand mandalas are incredibly intricate. And if you were to look at one, you would never believe that it was made out of sand because it's so detailed and so intricate, yet it's made out of all of these little granules of sand. Point of fact, it's not actual sand, it's dyed stone, crushed stone, but nonetheless, it has the qualities of sand, and they use these little instruments that go to drop these little sands in all of these places. And so it's definitely art, and it's definitely beautiful. However, if you watch them do it, it is absolutely a transcendent spiritual thing, and definitely meditative, and they have to be very, very focused on what they're doing. The other cool thing is all the times that I've seen the monk do this, I haven't ever seen them have a reference picture. Like, you know, even when we put together puzzles in the West, we have to have this kind of reference. But every time I've seen them do this, they're doing it from memory, which I think is extraordinary, because if you've seen these sand paintings, you'd be astounded about how intricate they are. So let's talk about the other side of this. Let's talk about art as a form of expressing these very subtle states of mysticism. When I was traveling, I would meet various monks from various not just Buddhist monks, but monks from various different religions, and the Buddhist monks I met were from very different traditions, and I found it interesting that we would always be able to find some common ground, and usually through symbolism. So it occurred to me that symbolism and art have always kind of been a vehicle of explaining very subtle spiritual states. In fact, that was the kind of theme behind an art show that me and my friend Poppy, who I mentioned earlier, we started an art show, monthly art show called the Art Ashram, and the whole idea was bringing artists together along spiritual themes and kind of revealing this mystical language. In dream interpretation, we call this language of the mind, or this unconscious language that our mind uses to create a dialogue with us. And I think artists, whether they mean to or not, really kind of tap into that unconscious language, and these become what Carl Jung referred to as archetypes. They become these archetypical images that relate whole ideas to us. They're very dynamic. They're not stagnant images. If you look at things like tarot decks or hero myths, they have this kind of dynamic, changing, symbolic language that we don't even have to know exactly what the definition of them is according to academia. are we kind of already know. Like if I showed you, I don't know, let's think of some really if I showed you the devil card in the tarot deck, you would immediately have a reaction to that. You would immediately have a kind of preconceived idea of what that is. It may vary from what the formal definition is, but you would know kind of what I'm talking about immediately. And so archetypes are like that. They all have this kind of predefined meaning that's universal. Universal is the word I'm looking for. So art is a great vehicle of not only transcending our own minds, but once we've transcended our own minds, art is a great vehicle to express the things that we have discovered. Poetry, art, writing, music have all been methods to kind of explain very subtle experiences that words just don't necessarily on their own don't necessarily do. Even though I mentioned poetry and writing, we can use poetry because we can kind of paint a picture within the mind. We can use flowery language and analogies and parables to explain ideas that are bigger than the actual words themselves. So that is my take on art and mysticism and how the two come together. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave me some comments down below or email me at calebstorms@gmail.com. Send me your ideas for future talks. I'd love to hear from you. And you can send those to the same thing or pop them down here. Please tell your friends, share, subscribe, and all that jazz. Peace out, kids.